Imagine standing in the middle of a battlefield at dawn. Your visor is snapped shut. You can barely see through two narrow slits. You can barely breathe. The air inside your helmet is already a stagnant metallic soup of carbon dioxide and rising heat. Your heart is pounding so hard it echoes against the steel cage around your head. You've been sealed into 25 kilograms of interlocking metal for over an hour, and suddenly, your biology betrays you.
Your body reminds you that you are not a legend. You are a human. You need to urinate now. But there is no bathroom. There is no pause button on a cavalry charge. There is no way out of the suit without a team of assistants, and the enemy is already forming ranks. This is the part of medieval history no Hollywood epic or oil painting shows you. When we picture a knight, we see polished steel flashing in the sun, a heroic silhouette. Museums reinforce this. At the Tower of London, immaculate suits of armor stand under soft spotlights, silent and sterile. But armor was never empty. Inside every one of those shining shells was a sweating, breathing, anxious, and physically desperate human body. And human bodies are not designed to be trapped in steel prisons.
Armorers were practical craftsmen. They understood riding mechanics. The hips and groin area could not be sealed by a single rigid plate. A knight had to sit in a saddle. This meant the crotch area was often protected by layered mail, segmented plates, or overlapping tassets. In theory, this offered limited flexibility. In practice, it offered no convenience. To urinate while armored required dismounting, assistance from a squire, loosening ties, manipulating layers of cloth and steel. In calm conditions, it was possible. In combat readiness, it was nearly impossible. The metal greaves and sabatons sealed the lower legs. Liquid had nowhere to go except downward. Wool absorbed, leather retained moisture, steel trapped heat. Now add environmental factors. Armor in sunlight heats dramatically. Inside temperatures could feel suffocating. A knight could lose liters of fluid per hour through sweat. Dehydration reduced urine production, but did not eliminate bodily needs entirely. Worse, moisture trapped against skin causes chafing. Repeated friction while riding creates raw skin. Raw skin invites infection, and medieval battlefields were not sterile environments. Urine is mildly acidic and salty. Against untreated steel, prolonged exposure encourages corrosion. Armor had to be cleaned quickly after battle, not just for appearance, but to prevent structural weakening. Ironically, stale urine was historically used in textile processing because ammonia helped degrease fabric. But fresh urine trapped inside armor was destructive. This was not merely embarrassing, it was mechanically and medically dangerous. The knight's body was in constant negotiation with the steel surrounding it, and steel always had the advantage. If you want to see this biological horror at its peak, we look at the Battle of Agincourt, 1415. The English army was dying before the battle even started. They were ravaged by dysentery, known then as the bloody flux. Dysentery isn't just a stomachache, it is violent, uncontrollable, and dehydrating. Medieval chroniclers describe a grim sight. English archers standing in the mud, some having cut the seats out of their breeches, others fighting completely naked from the waist down just to stay in the line. Now imagine the French knights. They were the tanks of the era, encased in full plate. As they advanced across rain-soaked, freshly plowed fields, the mud became a trap. Men tripped and fell. The weight of the armor made it impossible to stand back up in the slick clay. The battlefield of Agincourt didn't smell like cinematic heroism. It smelled like fear, wet earth, and thousands of men suffering from chronic diarrhea trapped inside metal cans. When you see a knight falling in the mud in this video, don't just think of the sword stroke. Think of the exhaustion. Think of the dignity lost. Agincourt reminds us that warfare wasn't just a clash of steel. It was a collision between human frailty and mechanical confinement. A battle is a sprint of terror.
But a siege is a marathon of misery. In the movies, the knight takes off his helmet the moment the sun sets. In reality, the sun was his enemy. During a siege, there was no clear beginning and no end, no referee to tell you when it was safe to breathe. Defenders on the castle walls lived in a state of permanent partial armored paranoia. You might unlace your gauntlets to eat, but the breastplate stayed on, the leg greaves stayed on, because removing a full harness was a 20-minute engineering project. If a ladder struck the stone or a horn sounded at 3 a.m., those 20 minutes were the difference between life and a dagger in your throat. So many chose the torture of the steel over the vulnerability of the skin. Imagine the Crusades. Under the white-hot sun of the Levant, a suit of armor didn't just protect you, it became an oven. The padded gambeson beneath the steel would become heavy, doubling in weight as it soaked up gallons of sweat. And here is the part history books skip, the biological breakdown. Fabric that stays damp for days against the body doesn't just smell, it disintegrates. This is where armor bite begins. The constant vibration of metal against wet cloth creates deep, raw friction burns on the shoulders, hips, and groin. In a world without antibiotics, these weren't just scratches, they were death sentences. The salt from your own sweat and the bacteria from your own waste would seep into these open sores. Your armor, the very thing keeping you alive from arrows, was now breeding an infection that would rot your skin from the inside out. There were no sterile bandages in a trench or on a rampart. There was only vinegar, rancid oil, and prayer. A knight could survive 100 sword strokes and 1,000 arrows, only to collapse weeks later from a fever born in the filth of his own suit. The steel that saved his life in the afternoon was slowly poisoning him by midnight. And yet they stayed inside. They endured the itching, the stinging, and the stench. Because in the medieval world, the only thing more terrifying than the rot inside the armor was the cold steel waiting outside of it. If you want to understand medieval war, you have to stop looking and start smelling. Forget the clean museum halls. Imagine 10,000 men and thousands of horses crammed into one muddy field with zero sanitation. A single war horse produces several kilograms of manure a day. Multiply that by a cavalry of thousands. In a moving army, there were no latrines. Men relieved themselves where they stood. Human waste mixed with horse manure. Rain turned it into a black slurry, and the summer heat baked it into a rising wall of ammonia. Medieval chroniclers called this miasma, corrupt air. They believed the smell itself could kill you, and they weren't entirely wrong. Where waste accumulates, clouds of flies follow. Water turns to poison, and the bloody flux, dysentery, begins to rot an army from the inside out. Now, put on the armor. Inside that steel harness, you don't breathe fresh air. You breathe a microclimate of your own making. The stench of the camp mingles with the internal sense of your suit, the sharp tang of scorching iron, the sour rot of damp, sweat-soaked leather, the suffocating musk of unwashed bodies. When a knight fell in battle, he didn't land on clean grass. He plunged into a mash of waste and mud. His visor and breathing vents became coated in the filth of the earth. And once the fighting stopped, the smell only grew. Medieval armies had no recovery teams. Bodies, human and animal, lay in the sun for days. In the summer heat, the air became thick, sweet, and heavy with decomposition. Even victory reeked. We see shining armor in museums because you cannot paint a stench. You cannot frame decay in gold leaf. When you look at a suit of armor today, you see the brilliance of the craft. But if you were inside it, gasping for air through narrow slits, you wouldn't just be fighting the enemy.
By the 16th century, armorers tried to address the groin problem with a feature that became legendary, the codpiece. Originally a practical flap of mail or fabric, it evolved into an exaggerated armored steel box. Some, like those belonging to Henry VIII, were massive and architectural. Technically, they were detachable. They suggested easy access. In reality, It was a lie. Removing a riveted metal codpiece while mounted on a restless warhorse was still a logistical nightmare. It wasn't a medieval zipper, it was a slight improvement on a terrible situation.
The real ordeal happened after the battle. Removing the armor was a ritual of pain. Steel had to be scrubbed with sand and vinegar to remove the salt and waste. Padded undergarments, soaked in sweat and grime, often adhered to open wounds. Removing them meant tearing off healing skin. Knights remained in this state for days during ambush-heavy campaigns. They endured chemical burns from their own sweat and urine, all for one reason. The alternative was worse. An unprotected torso facing a longbow arrow or a poleaxe meant a certain messy death. The myth of the shining knight survives because we look at the metal. But the reality of the Middle Ages is a story of brutal endurance. Armor didn't make men superhuman. It forced them to confront their humanity under the most extreme claustrophobic conditions imaginable. The next time you see a pristine suit of armor in the museum, don't just look at the shine. Look at the person who had to live and suffer inside it.